We don't want to have a Pete situation again.
Yeah.
No offence, Pete.
No, none taken, mate. None taken. not really any offence I can take there, is that? I fucked up, man. Do you ever speak to me like that again?
You know how they do like cold opens on podcasts where they just play a random soundbite? That may be it, Pete. Hello everyone and welcome to the Cacophony Sessions podcast. This is the first in what we hope will be a series of discussions about music. We're here to dissect your audio delights through the insights of various people who all share a common attribute, and that is passion for music. I'm your host for tonight's session, Dan, aka Golden E-Pump. Don't ask. This will serve as a kind of icebreaker episode. You'll find that we're all very passionate, and I'm sure there'll be some outlandish opinions. On the menu this evening is a veritable feast of opinionated pie as we ask the big question: what is the greatest year in music? Before that, let's get acquainted, shall we? I've decided to start a podcast because I love music. I love listening to music. I love making music. I love talking about music, some artists in particular, but I won't specify just yet in case some of you are playing some kind of drinking game. I love funk and soul music, but I do listen to most things, rock, pop, jazz, hip-hop, dance, a bit of everything really. I'm a misanthrope in rehabilitation at the moment. I used to hate everything, and then about 2 years ago I decided it's silly to exempt yourself from discovering new music and new sounds, so now I'm just annoyingly enthusiastic about everything. I'm a singer, nearly finished an album under my musical alias Danny W and the Dope, which consists of some of my co-collaborators here present. Never done a podcast before, but now I find myself at the base camp of Mount Discourse, boring you all to death. So, Martyn, if you could save me here, please.
Well, my name's Martyn, and I smell like Teen Spirit. Reference that we'll be talking about later.
Yeah.
To wash you dirty bastard.
No, I'm a guitar player. I love music. I'm not going to bore you with all that guitar playing stuff, because that's not what this is about. But music I listen to is the best music that's ever been made, and it's better than any of the music that you listen to every time. I like almost any genre, except for what's that stuff they call on the adverts you get these days? You know, the bank adverts where you've got like an old Depeche Mode song and you've got some lady singing it with a whispery voice and some plinky piano and everybody's crying.
I think it's called shit.
Yes, it is. that sort of thing. That's fancy music. I'll listen to almost anything as long as it's good and well made. But yeah, that's me. So I'll pass over to Tom.
Thanks, Martyn. So I'm Tom. So music-wise, my background's actually in classical music. I've played piano since I was about 4. I'm very into obscure modern stuff, serialism, minimalism, that sort of thing. I've been spending lockdown recording an album of minimalist piano, which I'm sure everyone's desperate to hear. As a teenager, I played clarinet and played in jazz and swing, and then puberty hit, and like everyone else, I wanted to be a rock star after failing at being a music journalist when I was at university. I play bass and a bit of guitar. I played in bands with both Dan and Martyn. I played in a grunge band. That was the closest to success I ever got, and that was one slot on BBC Introducing and a couple of live radio sessions. But hey, I'll take it because my day job doesn't pay too badly. In terms of my taste in music, you tend to find if it's heavy and predominantly instrumental, it's probably where I am. But I like lots of things. As I say, background, classical, jazz. Hip hop and electronic are a little bit of blind spots for me. There's a couple of albums I really love, but I'm using this partly as an opportunity to dig deeper into those genres from some guys who know a lot about them, and hopefully I'll be able to inflict on them some experimental rock music. I already have with one album, and you'll hear about that later. Right, okay, we'll pass on to Pete.
Thank you, Tom. So my name's Pete. Same, got obviously a huge interest in music, hence doing the or participating in the podcast. So I've recorded various sort of projects for years, but it's kind of projects that eternally sort of don't get finished. And so I'm actually trying to really finish my latest project. So I record under the name Stereofied, and I'm trying to do sort of a pop R&B hip hoppy kind of album. So hopefully I'll be completing that soon. That'll be out sort of within the next six months to a year. And apart from that, sort of music-wise, I listen to a lot of hip-hop, a lot of old-school hip-hop, but sort of dip into all kinds of styles of music, but predominantly hip-hop and R&B, I'd say, mainly. And I'll pass you over to Dave.
Hi there, my name's David. I go under the DJ name DJ Funktivus. I DJ over the last few years in the southwest area, but previous to that I lived in South London, in Brixton and Morden and the South London area. I was very heavily into the golden era of hip-hop and DJ'd that genre, and then got into the samples of which that comprised, so funk and soul. I've been involved with funk and soul projects in the southwest. Did a degree in music technology and sound technology, and I'm currently a part-time DJ and involved in hospitality, but a long-serving lover of music. So
excellent. So that's everybody on the podcast. I think we've got a topic this evening that we should be able to get some mileage out of. What is the greatest year in music history? This is going to be a series of opinions, really, because you can't really talk about music from an objective level. I'm sure Tom could very easily, but maybe not. I certainly can't make that distinction between talking about music as an art form objectively, just with bangers I really love. So with that, I picked 1987. That was the year I was born. That's not the reason I've nominated it. But it was a year that, well, I look back on. I made a playlist and it is just chock full of bangers. And the pop music scene at the time was coming to the end of the 80s and the start of something new in terms of new jack swing, etc. So pop music was evolving. There were a lot of hip hop acts that debuted in that year, such as Public Enemy, Ice-T, Eric B and Rakim, DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince with their debut as well. So music's changing in 1987. The pop sound is very much a kind of hybrid of Stock Aitken and Walkman and New Jack Swing acts with that sound as well. Some of the biggest songs that year, you've got Tiffany with I Think We're Alone Now, Rick Astley, Never Gonna Give You Up, which has been memed to death, but is still a great pop song in my opinion. And you've got, as I said, Stock Aitken and Waterman's Mel and Kim's Respectable came out that year, which I think is possibly their best single. In other fields, dance music just starting to come through. You have things like Mars's Pump Up the Volume, Steve Silk Hurley's Jack Your Body, which was number one the week I was born. Number one the week I was born, announcing Chicago house as a thing. So that music's changing very much in 1987. You've got the end of hair metal, and bands like Whitesnake are still releasing great albums, but it's shaping differently because now you've got Guns N' Roses launching Appetite for Destruction in 87. So you've got other rock acts that are coming through as well. U2 have their mainstream breakthrough in the Joshua Tree, which is widely regarded as one of, if not their best album they ever did. The Smiths released their last album, Strange Ways, Here We Come. You got the House Martins with their final album, The People Who Grinned Themselves to Death. Bon Jovi are here with their biggest album, Slippery When Wet are arriving. Heart have got a big single, Alone. So rock music is alive and well. It's a big year for nostalgia. With Benny King, Stand By Me, the re-release of that got to number 1, and so did Reap Critique by Jackie Wilson. You've also got acts like Starship, which were comprised of members of Jefferson Starship and Jefferson Airplane, coming back with the number 1 hit. I think Grace Slick, the singer for Starship, was the oldest female to ever have a number 1 hit in the UK with Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now. So big year for acts coming back. You've got Michael Jackson's Bad is very much in the fabric of culture at the time. George Michael's Faith, Terence Trent D'Arby's, now known as Sananda Maitreya, his debut, introducing the hard line. You've got Alexander O'Neill's Hearsay, and then from where he came from in terms of Flight Time, Jam and Lewis are working with just off the back of Control with Janet Jackson, and then Prince is doing his thing with Sign of the Times, his best record, possibly his best protege record in my opinion as well. Jill Jones's album comes out that year as well, and you've even got great one-off singles from people like Robbie Neville had a hit with C'est La Vie, which is one of the best one-hit wonders of all time. And I think I'm going to kind of bring it cohesively and say that I think the thing that sold it for me the most is the fact that 1987 has, in my opinion, the greatest Christmas number 1, and that is You're Always on My Mind by the Pet Shop Boys.
It's not a Christmas song.
It is a Christmas song.
Agreed. Not a Christmas song.
It's an Elvis song.
It is but it's still released as a Christmas number 1 from the Pet Shop Boys.
Just like Killing in the Name is a Christmas song now, by that logic.
We built this city on sausage rolls or some shit.
Yeah. Or Mad World, the cover of Tears for Fears.
Jesus.
You know, if you're going with what's the best Christmas number 1, it's got to be Killing in the Name of, even though it's not in the spirit of it.
The Pet Shop Boys, You're Always on My Mind. I think that's a better song than Rage Against the Machine.
The Frog song's the one.
What, the Crazy Frog?
Paul McCartney and his Frogs.
Oh, yeah. No, that's not a good song.
It's brilliant. It's art, mate.
That was a lot of information, Dan. I enjoyed that.
Dan, you missed.
What I particularly liked is he touched upon Steve Selk-Healy's Jack Your Body, which was... I'm going to go with 1989 in a minute, and that's going to talk about the English summer of love with dance music, but really touched upon Detroit and Chicago. House music was happening way before that. And yeah, that was the anthem back in the day. What an absolute tune that was.
What year did Voodoo Ray come out?
Would have been Hacienda days, 89 or 90. I'll have to double check that. But
see, I just find it bizarre that you can go through 1987 without mentioning Sister by Sonic Youth, or is it Nirvana's first album, 1987?
I think Bleach came out in 88.
Yeah, before Grohl starts drumming.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they went through like 4 drummers before Grohl, didn't they?
Yeah.
Chad Channing.
Yeah, there was some others as well.
There were several other things that did happen in 97 that are music related, but not necessarily releases. I mean, you've got Chuck Berry gets a Hollywood star on the Walk of Fame. You've got Aretha Franklin is inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as the first woman as well, and I think that's a significant moment, especially
that's massive, really, isn't it?
When you talk about 2020 and things that are happening in the world around us at the moment. That's a big leap forward in terms of progression. So I think
also, she was never pandered to. She was also given tracks which were given to other predominant male artists and did a better job and competed on an imbalanced society. So made a better job of a record in a biased society. So yeah, absolute boss she was.
Mm-hmm. Let's hear from you.
Okay, lovely stuff. So the year I've chosen is 1989. I was going to touch upon the fact that in England, it's the second summer of love. It's talked about when a lot of sort of illegal raves, and the band Orbital took their name because everybody was doing raves illegally on the M25, which was known as the Orbital Road. So we've got a lot of touching in on that scenario, and a lot of albums that came out that year had that kind of ilk. So Stone Roses' debut album came out then, which is obviously based in Hacienda. Soul to Soul came out with Club Classics Volume 1, and many other dance albums that were coming out that particular year, and it was kind of breaking through the mainstream. I Love Acid, or I think the track was breaking through and was on the top 10 that year with Acid House. Also notable sort of break-off genres is the reason I chose this year is it's the Pixies' Doolittle album comes out that year. The Cure's Disintegration.
Oh,
Best
Bangers.
that's their best album.
Yeah, best Cure album.
Bleach, as we touched upon before, Nirvana comes out that year. Technique, New Order, which kind of branches them off into a new genre. The Real Thing, Faith No More, Spike, Elvis Costello. Sonic Temple by The Cult. And it sort of sparks a kind of branching of many genres, really, where not only dance music is sort of sprung in that direction, but it's starting to pull away from sort of gothic pop music and going into the grunge scene. And sort of hair metal is starting to branch off into slightly more complex genres as well. Dr. Feelgood, Motley Crue comes out that year. Mother's Milk, Red Hot Chili Peppers was that year as well. Yeah, it's really sort of following on from Dan in 1987. It's really starting to branch off into what we know in the modern days to be the forming of a lot of sub-genres. So it's a year which I find fairly interesting. On top of the fact it's following on with a lot of seminal hip-hop albums. Paul's Boutique by the Beastie Boys comes out that year. Like a Prayer, Madonna comes out that year. Nile Rodgers is heavily involved with trying to shift from the disco scene when you had the back end of Disco Sucks. And they're trying to really sort of hone in on something else they can grab a hold of there, where everyone is basically sampling Good Times, and he's looking to try to shift more into working with more progressive artists. Nina Cherry in the UK has got Raw Like Sushi that comes out that year. And Janet Jackson's following up with many albums that they're on top of. Obviously, me and Dan's favourite artist, Prince, does Batman's soundtrack that year. Bat Dance comes out. So yeah, it's an odd year. This is why I've kind of chosen on it. It's sort of hip hop is progressing from sort of like a kitsch sort of disco spin-off to being its own genre. Dance music is starting to come into its own. Grunge music is starting to properly be formed, and things are starting to move away from the punk scene and moving into sort of new wave. So that's the reason I've picked upon this year and why I find it particularly interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of factors there, aren't there?
Yeah, it's a real sort of branching point.
It seems like there's a lot of sort of musical styles that were really getting ready to be propelled sort of into the 90s, if you see what I mean. That, you know, they're sort of primed and ready at the end of the decade, and then it just sort of exploded, you know, into the.
It was a launch pad for the 90s, wasn't it?
Fig Street High and Rising as well come out that year, 1989.
Yeah.
So
Which
is
first album.
Break away from gangster rap and coming into sort of what would then lead into sort of neo soul and
alternative hip hop.
More sort of progressive thoughts on what is hip hop, rather than sort of talking about your jewels in your car or whatever and what clout you've got on the street, to trying to completely devolve yourself away from that. And it's the same with Paul's Boutique. They came a long road, the Beastie Boys, from being a punk rock band to being something which was sort of neo-hippie to back around to their sort of style of things. So yeah, it's a real sort of branching point, which is why I like that particular year. It's setting off for the old and starting off for the new and branching off in interesting directions.
But that's interesting that you say that, because 3 Feet High and Rising makes me think of that, because I think it was that album that really, if I'm correct, like propelled the recording industry, had to lobby to get the laws changed, I believe, about sampling, wasn't it? Because there were just such a huge amount of samples on the
That was Paul's record. That was Paul's too.
There's both of them. Unfortunately, the copyright law comes in that year and kind of fucks both of them, because before it was kind of the Wild West, and the reason why De La Soul still tour to this day is because they haven't made the sort of publishing and royalty money they should have made off the album, because it's been ripped out from underneath them. Whereas before it was just the absolute Wild West. Sampling is really took a hold there. People have creamed quite a lot of the crop, and people are starting to get really litigious in 1989.
I find it really odd, the whole sampling debate, because actually if you go back to the 60s, classical music in the 60s, like the minimalist movement is all like Steve Reich, whose entire careers are based around sampling, which I just find I find it really strange that it took until the 1980s for that debate to happen. And I think it's also bad that art lost.
Exactly. Yeah.
Although 2 albums in 1989 that I'm not sure if you mentioned. Did you mention 9 Inch Nails' Pretty Hate Machine?
Exactly. I was waiting for that, Tom.
I did it. It was on my list, yes.
How could you flipping miss that? It's one of the seminal albums.
And there's one that you haven't mentioned, Martin, either, which is the Jesus and Mary Chain's Automatic as well.
Yeah. Well, I don't rate the album much. I'm more of a Psycho Candy man.
Psycho Candy is a great album.
Yeah. Psycho Candy is a better album, but it's still a decent album.
A good album, to be fair.
Yeah,
it's good point. I stand corrected, Tom.
I'm surprised that you hadn't brought it up, considering that every time we talk about Scottish bands, you always tell me that they're the best one.
Sing on 9 Inch Nails, man. You know that.
I'm just going to point out, Dan, that the Bon Jovi Slippery When Wet actually came out in August '86.
It was a hit in '87.
It was the biggest selling album of '87, but it actually came out in '86.
I'm not 100% sure that you can have that then, Dan.
No. This is my whole argument for my year. Based on these technicalities.
Okay, I will strike Slippery When Wet from the list, but I still think that my argument stands. I don't think that that's as vital to my argument. It's something like Sign of the Times.
It's the same as my argument with dance music. If it didn't really hit the shores of England to the second Summer of Love '89, but as he's pointed out, there's plenty of dance music.
Much like I was born in '87, I was conceived in '86, but I wouldn't say that I was from 1986. So the next year we've got is 1991. Now, interestingly, we have 2 people that are vouching for 1991. At first, I wasn't going to allow it, but I thought, no, this is an opinionated show. People should be allowed to stand and fight for their own opinions. And if 2 people have the same opinion, then that just helps the conversation, I think. So I'm going to go to Pete first for his thoughts on 1991. Pete.
Okay, so I chose 1991. I think what I'd like to focus on like the most is just like some of the albums that came out that I think are just sort of so huge in that year. Nirvana's Nevermind is from 91. Pearl Jam's 10 is 1991. Michael Jackson's Dangerous. And then there's things like Boyz II Men came out in 1991 with Cooley High Harmony, which had End of the Road on it, which I believe was at number 1 in the USA for about 18 weeks, I think. That was sort of record breaking at the time.
From
and that and obviously and they had a lot of production by Dallas Austin as well, who is has gone on, I think, to be one of the great sort of songwriters who's worked then with Pink and various things. So it sort of was a bit of a launching pad for his career as well, I think. And then R.E.M. released Out of Time, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Blood, Sex, Sugar Magic, Primal Scream, Screamadelica, Tupac's first album, Tupacalypse. And in hip-hop, I think it was a very interesting year because you've got A Tribe Called Quest, the Low End Theory comes out, which is obviously going to be up there, always discussed with the real top level of the greatest hip hop albums of all time.
Yeah, it's my favourite.
Yeah, you're just on the kind of cusp of what they call the golden era there, aren't you, Pete?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, you've got Cypress Hill's debut album comes out in '91 as well.
I saw a documentary recently with DJ Muggs, saying that he had a record collection of 150 records that he did that album with, and now he's got a record collection of 350,000, and he still can't knock out the same sort of caliber.
Really? Yeah. No, I can imagine. Wow, it's like when you listen to something like Cypress Hill. I think it must be difficult to keep up that level of creativity over that longer time. I think. Do you know what I mean? Like it's so, and they were very different as well, weren't they? I mean, they were talking about slightly other things. I mean, it was gangster rap to a certain extent, but they talked a lot about.
It was just like the drums they were using, the meters and skull snaps, and a lot of like really hard hitting funk, which was kind of odd at the time.
Yeah. The other album that I wanted to mention in hip hop as well, which I think is a great album, is Main Source. Breaking Atoms came out that year.
Large Professor, what a fucking G!
That is such an album, man.
Looking at the front door, and interestingly as well in hip hop. So Main Source, Breaking Atoms. I believe the track is called Live at the Barbecue, which is Nas's first ever recorded verse.
Yeah. Or he does a year and a half later the 10 tracks of, obviously, I'll let you fill in the gaps.
Illmatic.
Yeah.
Boom,
yeah.
Boom, boom, boom.
So that's obviously sort of hugely significant. And then just before I pass over to Martyn, who I know has chosen 91 as well, there's just two albums that I wanted to mention that are just sort of are very much that 91 sound. And that is 808 State released XL, and the KLF released The White Room.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's where it's just starting to tip into rave culture in this country, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think 808 State, I mean, that's just, they're such an incredible group. I remember when I was like a kid, I mean, I would have been 7 in 91. So I can remember having a couple of 808 State tracks on sort of cassettes you buy as a kid, those hits compilations kind of things. And you listen to things like 808 State, it's like so different from the kind of stuff you're hearing that much on the radio and things like that. And then The White Room by the KLF is just sort of an unbelievable piece of work, really. Do you know what I mean? And it's hugely influential, just sort of goes across all genres and is amazing.
Did you ever hear the urban myth that the KLF, it was a thing, they recorded it, they burnt £1 million from their record deal, they got paid $1 million to do their second album, and they burnt it live on camera. And
it's not an urban myth, I think that really happened.
The fact.
Yeah, they filmed it, didn't they? But I do remember reading I read an interview, I read a few interviews, I can't remember, but there was a focus on the KLF or an article in Q at some time, and basically they said, the interviewer said that they'd spoken to someone who was around them when they burned that £1 million, and who thinks that it did actually hit them at some point, the enormity of what they'd actually done. Do you know what I mean? Like
in 1990, £1 million with inflation surely would have been like 5 billion in today's money.
Yes, it's a significant sum of money, definitely.
Yeah, I think it's about 4.6.
Mm-hmm.
With the rate of inflation.
Thank you for that update from the banks there.
And then I believe they either tried and succeeded at deleting their back catalogue as well, didn't they?
Yes.
I think they deleted their songs, and then that was it.
And they also wrote a book called How to Write a Hit Record, and I think they actually made a hit record by using what they wrote in the book.
I heard about that, I heard about
that. Kind of like the band Blues Traveller that wrote the record The Hook, where they just took the piss out of the hookiest chords they could, and they actually ended up being a hook.
There's a story about Radiohead like that as well. I think it's My Iron Lung, where Johnny Greenwood and Tom York had a competition to write a song with the most chords in it. And came out of that. There we go, digressing. Well, for me, it was a very pivotal year because one album that really, really kind of changed my life was Chris Rere's Auberge. It was because Chris Rea was the first gig I ever went to. To be honest with you, I didn't even really like the album that much. I liked a couple of songs, still don't. Thought Chris Rea was all right. A mate of mine liked him, went to the gig. Anyway, so that's 1991.
My old man used to love God's Great Banana Skin. What year was that? Do you know, Mark?
Crikey, what year was that? That wasn't bad, man. I've got time, Chris Rea, but anyway, 1991. Okay. I just want to say 87 and 89, both great years. And I think especially 89 was like the Summer of Love, whereas 91 is like Altamont. A lot of things happened in 91 where the world changed. So we've got things like it's the final year of the Cold War. So a lot of weird things happening politically in Russia. Kuwait invasion, early 91. Bosnian War started in 1991, okay? And also the Rodney King riots. Now, these are really important. Why I'm talking about these in a music podcast is because they informed the music that came out in 91. I'm not going to go too much into hip-hop because Pete has more than covered that. But you have things like Ice-T's OG, New Jack City soundtrack, Boys in the Hood soundtrack. You had your Public Enemy. You had also Ice Cube with his really... what album was that? Ice Cube. Not Predator. It was Death Certificate, which is all about the whole Rodney King thing. So there's a lot of anger amongst the hip-hop community.
It's being echoed pretty much again now.
So, well, yes, it's happening again now. A Gangstar Step in the Arena as well, along with Main Source's Breaking Atoms, both groundbreaking. DJ Premier, obviously, genius. But anyway, I'm not going to carry on any more about hip-hop because, as I say, Pete has more than covered that. However, more sort of dance music, I'm not really going to talk too much about that because Pete has mentioned it as well. White Room, KLF, 808 State. Also, the Orbs debut album, they became huge, had a top 40 hit with the longest single ever made. And that's a record that will never be beaten because it goes over 39 minutes, 59 seconds. It's not a single, it's an EP. So, yeah, a lot of really interesting experimental stuff happening in electronic music. It became music that you can start listening to at home as well as out and about. So around that time, you had bands like Left Field and, those sorts of guys who were really sort of groundbreaking. So there's a lot going on. Alternative rock now. This is my area of kind of expertise. Grunge, let's face it, Nirvana's Nevermind was a game changer. Pearl Jam's 10 was a game changer. Soundgarden's Bad Motor Finger. You've got bands like Dinosaur Jr. had an album out.
Yes, yeah.
Primus had an album out. Fucking Primus, Yes. Absolutely stunning. Green Day had an album out, okay?
It's not a good album.
Gish by the Smashing Pumpkins had an album out, Another massive... grunge, it just destroyed the whole musical landscape. Not just in guitar music, but it informed everything. It was the biggest cultural musical moment we have ever had since the 60s. And also, we have other genres coming up. We're talking about psychedelic. You've got new psychedelia at that time. Mercury Rev came out with Your Self-Esteem. And you've got Recurring Spacemen 3 came out, coming off the back of Stuart Kember leaving Spiritualized. Then you've got an absolutely stunningly influential album, almost invented a genre which is closely linked to another album by an 80s band who released an album that year, which is seen as their best album. So I've done them both. Spiderland by Slint, post-rock. It is an absolutely wonderful album. Very difficult, very troubling for the band to make. They had to go into therapy afterwards. And that's linked to Talk's Laughingstock.
I was waiting for that. I was waiting for that one.
They are credited with inventing post-rock.
Yeah.
The way that album particularly was made. Now, as far as listening is concerned, I prefer Spirit of Eden and what's the other one? Spirit of Eden and Colour of Spring.
Colour of Spring, that's it.
I prefer those two, but they're just I don't know, there's probably a tiny little bit less space, more instrumentation, but Laughing Stock, the way it was recorded, where they basically were in a pitch black room. They had like 50-something session musicians throughout the recording of it, and they'd have separate parts, and they'd have hours of just parts of music, and they'd edit them together. And these things were recorded in a pitch black studio or with minimal candlelight, and it just created this atmosphere that, which now carries on through to, any post rock band you want to talk about. It's just that, the Talk album is very quiet, it's very restrained, and then you've got post-rock guys like Mogwai and Explosions in the Sky take that as a template but whack in a load of wall of noise in there, which is exactly what I would do with any music. But anyway.
Very familiar with that.
Yeah, we are very familiar with that.
You've also got a rise in something that actually had a massive impact in kind of early 2000s indie dance music. You had don't laugh, EMF's debut album, right? It's actually brilliant, and it was a game changer. Schubert did. It was like, at the time, seen as a pop records, everyone thinks of Unbelievable, but mate, it's some bangers on there, and the actual musicianship is fantastic. The guitarist Ian Dench then went on to do songwriting for like major pop stars. I can't name any, but he did. You also had Electronic came out. Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark had an album out. Yes. Jesus Jones had an album out, who were very similar to EMF. James had an album out as well. So there was a lot going on in kind of the crossover between dance and indie, which now is like normal. Everybody's doing it.
Spiral Carpets had an album out that year as well, Mark?
I'm not sure. They may well have done. I haven't noted it down. Another massive, huge album again, but it's not their best, but it set them on the way to being, what they are today. Leisure by Blur came out. Fantastic.
Yes.
Shoegaze indie. What an album. I love every note on it. But anyway, I'm going to move on to my final thing, and I think Tom knows what's coming here.
Yeah, I was waiting for it.
It's something that was kind of being built on in the 80s by bands like the Jesus and Mary Chain, Cocteau Twins, all those guys. My Bloody Valentine's Loveless came out. Now, this is, for me, one of the most important albums ever made in music.
Yeah, you're not really asked about it, eh?
It's absolutely... The way it was recorded, it nearly bankrupted the record company. It took years to make. I think there's a rumour that it cost something like $50,000 for... Kevin Shields to get a snare drum right or something. It took him weeks. And he used to hang speakers out of the studio and play his guitar music to passing dogs so that he could see how the frequencies affected them, things like that. Rumour, truth, I don't know. Nobody knows. But what it did is it absolutely changed the way guitar is played from that moment on through to now. I'll give you a really silly example. So if you've heard Loveless, you'll know it sounds like it keeps going in and out of tune, and it's just kind of wavy and dreamy, and it's like, it doesn't sound right, but it really is. Listen to Yellow by Coldplay, and that's just an MBV, literally. Everybody does it now. Everybody does the whammy bar while they're playing chords. I do it. I'd love to be like MBV, but I'm not. But, it's the influence of that album is just massively, it's huge. And of course, you had Slowdive had an album out that time as well, in that year as well. I think it was their second album. I can't remember what it's called now. But anyway, you got Slowdive, MBV, Dinosaur Jr. are sometimes lumped in. They're not shoegaze really, but they're lumped in with that kind of thing. Swerve Driver, one of my favourite bands, their debut album, definitely were called shoegaze at the time, but kind of more grunge rock, I guess, but absolutely brilliant band. Caius had an album out. Screamadelica, again, another groundbreaking album. Primal Scream went on to be relevant for probably the rest of the decade and well into the next one. Temple of the Dog, I didn't mention that. Grunge, great album. All these albums, they keep coming back to me, and it was just a rich year. But why I think it's so rich and why I think the year was so important is, what I'll talk about next quickly, is Lollapalooza. Okay, you had Jane's Addiction, they were splitting up, playing their last tour. So sad for them to split up. And then you had people like Nine Inch Nails, Ministry, Ice Cube, who else was on that bill? But, you know, it had all the Jim Rose Circus sideshow and all that stuff. It was like that kind of embodied what was happening in that year, where you have this Summer of Love, but now all this stuff is going on. It's a bit like what we're going through right now. People are going, oh, we're really sick of this. And the music reflected it perfectly. Not only did it reflect the political climate and how people were thinking, and you had your disaffected youth into your Nirvana going, oh, someone's listening to us, but also what it was springboarded. So 1991, I'm not saying is the best year, but I'm saying it's the most revolutionary year since the 60s musically, because everything changed. I mean, what happened in the next few years is just, you know, the amount of impressive music that came out, the rise in all these different genres. It was kind of already branching out from the 80s, but here it was like kind of, I don't know, there were so many more nodes to the branches. There was so much going on. For me, 91 is the most important year in music.
I think that that may have had something to do with the rise of the CD at that time.
That probably played a part, yeah.
The
accessibility of music.
They got it right in 91. In the late 80s, a lot of CDs are tinny. There's not a lot of low end. They didn't really get it right. But in 1991, that's when quality production started happening in digital records.
Also, music TV was very important. MTV played music. You had 120 Minutes, Headbangers Ball. You had MTV Raps. You had all these shows that catered for specific genres of music, but they would cross over. Beavis and Butthead, for Christ's sake. And then music TV in that era was really, really good. And British music TV as well.
I think you'd had a few years of MTV where the novelty of the video had worn off a bit. It wasn't just about the video. It was making that video into art and saying something meaningful in 91. So that's why you've got the difference between, say, Thriller in 82. I think that came out back in 82. And that comes out. The video is a big, campy dance routine. But then what Michael Jackson's doing in 91 with the music video, where he stretches the medium and makes a political statement with the black or white video, with the reference to the Black Panthers and morphing, and it's just a better quality video.
And that time in the UK as well, you had the kind of neo-soul backlash. You had Young Disciples with Apparently Nothing, and There's Nothing Like This of Omar. And
that's a great song.
Good stuff, man. Yeah.
Yes.
There's Nothing Like This is a great song.
Yeah, it was kind of like they were harking back to the sort of Northern Soul days. Yarborough and Peebles as well, and Evelyn King, and a lot of stuff that then got sampled later on in dance music. There was a real good neo-soul backlash in the early 90s.
Yeah.
We forgot to mention Massive Attack's Blue Lines. I mean,
you did forget that
album. That's a massive album. That's a game changer. You know?
We've also had two people talk about 91. Nobody's mentioned Diamonds and Pearls.
I wasn't.
Martyn?
Yeah.
I was surprised. I didn't hear you say that much about Pearl Jam's 10, I think, mate.
It doesn't need to be saying it, because if we're going to do these regular podcasts, believe me, you'll be hearing about Pearl Jam.
I had a feeling he might say that.
yeah.
I didn't actually get that
Point made.
very, very, very later on in the day. And in fact, when I left school and I did my first job, it was kind of a disabled carer up in the Midlands, and I found Pearl Jam's 10 really late in the day. It would have been like maybe 98, 99, in the CD player that I inherited. It was the only CD I had in the flat at that time when I'd left home. It fucking blew my mind.
It could have gone either way. It could have driven you mad or given you a good time. I'm glad to hear.
Even Flow is still one of my favourite tracks, and I love the Rearview Mirror remix of it. It's so good.
It's all about
it's
black.
Just a beautiful album. The last song in it does it for me. But anyway, we're just going to for another day discussing years of music.
Speaking of other days, I think Tom's got the latest entry in terms of contemporary times. 2003.
Yeah, so I thought about this a lot because there's really good arguments for lots of years. Because if you look at the surveys that have been done, 69 always wins because there's Woodstock, the two Led Zeppelin albums, and Abbey Road, and The Birth of Punk is 69. Or 71 always goes up there with like Marvin Gaye and John Lennon's Imagine. 77, The Birth of Post-Punk. I'm really surprised you didn't go for 1984, Dan, because of Purple Rain, Wham's Make It Big, and Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA.
I think it was possibly my second favourite. 78 was up there as well. But I think in the end, just because of the sheer volume of tracks that I appreciated when I made that playlist, that's why 87 got the nod. Not because of anything important that happened. It was more to do with just the sheer volume of songs that I liked from that year.
And like, I love a lot of albums from 1991. As most of you know, I'm a huge Smashing Pumpkins fan, and obviously that's the year that they started. The reason why I didn't go for 1991 is 1991 we remember as really important with hindsight. But the thing is, at the time, people didn't care. You know, the two biggest selling albums are Bryan Adams and fucking Michael Bolton. You know, like My Bloody Valentine's Loveless, in 12 years post-release, sold 225,000 copies. Spiderland, in its lifetime, has only sold 50,000 copies, and nobody even mentioned it as being a good album, like journalistically, until 1998. So the thing is, so when we look back at it, 1991 was really important. But the thing is, when I tried to pick a year, I wanted to pick a year where the general public were getting into this. And this is why 2003 is really important, because 2003, so the first ever popular music streaming service was Last FM from 2002. I know there was one, the Underground Music Archive, from 93. But 2003 saw the launch of MySpace and the iTunes Store. Which
Pandora was fairly popular back in the day as well.
Yeah, but like the iTunes Store and MySpace completely changed the way that everybody discovered music and the way we listened to it. And that had another side effect in that it really drove down the cost of albums. So in like the 1980s and 90s, a CD would cost you a tenner, which in today's money is like 30 or 40 quid. Whereas in 2003, I used to go to Virgin Megastore and you could buy 5 for 30 quid. So you were able to get more albums, and it made more albums accessible. For example, and it made the music that wouldn't have sold well before sell really well. The one that comes to mind is Dizzy Rascal's debut album, Boy in the Corner. Now, I know it won the Mercury Music Prize at the end of that year, but in 2003, that sold 250,000 copies and achieved loads of acclaim, and obviously kickstarted the whole grime scene that we've got today. Not my thing, but there you go. Whereas Nevermind, which was an album by an already established artist, by the end of 1991, had only shipped about 90,000 copies because that's all they'd printed. It only really started selling well in 1992, which I find bizarre. Starting with 2003, let's start with singles. So there are some really, really important releases in 2003, arguably important in general. So we had the release of, I don't particularly love any of these, but they're quite important. So we've got Crazy in Love by Beyonce, Toxic by Britney Spears, Hey Ya by Outkast, Ignition Remix by R. Kelly, and Milkshake by Khalees. They're all, if you go to any nightclub in the country, they still play them all the time.
I think I had that as my exact playlist the other day.
Yeah, probably. The other
Tom,
yeah.
Which is your favourite out of those 5?
Good question. Great question.
Yeah, that's like asking which part of the shit sandwich I want to eat. I'll probably go from Hey Ya by Outkast.
It's a little bit harsh, isn't that? I mean, Khalees is a great artist who worked with Pharrell Williams and the Neptunes. Yeah. I mean, Milkshake is a Neptunes produced song as well.
Don't get me wrong. Like, she's a great artist. That's not my favorite. That's not my favorite of her songs. Another really important song that came out that year, important because I think it's probably about to chart again now, is Where Is the Love by Black Eyed Peas. It's that year. Now, 2003 is a year that guitar-based music, which is my thing, really hit the mainstream more than it ever really had before. If you go down like the top 100 tracks of the year, you've got tracks by White Stripes, Jet, the Dandy Warhols. That year, the Shins released Shoots Too Narrow, which in a Hollywood film, Natalie Portman in Garden State describes that album as, "It will change your life, I swear." It really will. It's great. That was the soundtrack of my summer for years. You've got like fairly big indie bands really hitting the stadiums, like Placebo released Sleeping with Ghosts, Muse released Absolution. They're great albums, not necessarily the best work of those artists, but it really launched them into the mainstream. I hate to say this, but like Coldplay released probably their only half decent album in 2003, and that influenced so many people. You go to music from the late 2000s even today.
Silver was a banger.
Yeah, but it's like Keane, Imagine Dragons, Codaline. They're all taking that blueprint of that Coldplay album.
People are still copying Coldplay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lewis Capaldi.
Yeah.
2003 was the year that I went to university. I remember buying an NME, and it gave me Rock and Roll Riot Volume 1 CD on the front, which had like British Sea Power and the hot.
I'm getting to those.
but I was loving that.
Yeah, it was great, and it's also the year that gave us The Darkness, which for my age group, like Dan and I, we all remember The Darkness, and it was great fun. Other important things that happened in 2003. So 2003 was just at the beginning of when I was wanting to be a music journalist, and it really was the launch of this sort of Oxford music scene. The debut releases by 65 Days of Static came out that year, which added drum and bass and electronics to post-rock music in a way nobody had done before, and really influenced that scene. Youth Movie Soundtrack Strategies released their debut EP, which is actually surprisingly heavy, but they mixed like proggy and mathy elements into indie rock, which led to the inception of Foals, and that Foals obviously changed indie a lot in the late 2000s and the 2010s. Another big release that year was Echoes by The Rapture. That really took like the angular indie of bands like Gang of Four.
That's a great album.
Yeah. And they added electronics to it in a way that had the way that sort of, I think it's what people from 1991 possibly had in their head when they were trying to do it. And Echoes by The Rapture, you can hear that when you listen to like Block Party and The Bravery and bands like that who had a really big influence. It was the debut EP from Arcade Fire, came out that year, and they went on to be huge. But yeah, other releases that year, the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, The Postal Service, which is just a beautiful album. Death Cab for Cutie released Transatlanticism, another beautiful album. Super Furry Animals, Phantom Power, My Morning Jacket released a great album that year. The Thrills, So Much for the City. Cat Power released the album which has He War on it. British Sea Power's debut, which is just brilliant. And Phil Spector produced a Star Sailor record, which is quite interesting. But then moving away from indie, at the heavy end, you've got Deftones released their self-titled album, which really was the first time that anybody had taken the comedy, corny stuff out of nu metal and made it this really sort of heavy, pure thing. And
is that the one with
Minerva?
On
yeah. Yes. It is the one with Minerva on it.
That's so shoegaze. It really.
Yeah, and well, yeah, I remember you saying it's a very important track, and that was on that album. That made the charts. That's how I discovered Deftones.
It's beautiful.
Two supergroups released albums that year. A Perfect Circle released 13th Step, and Billy Corgan made his only ever happy album with the band's One, which is definitely worth checking out. Ocean Size released their debut, which really did launch a genre of its own because they blended grunge and post-rock, and like they redefined alternative prog. Those aren't my words; they're the words of Mike Portnoy from Dream Theater. 2003 saw the release of Fallen by Evanescence, which that really brought bands like Nightwish. I mean, I'm not an Evanescence fan.
I went back to it the other week, and
my mum loved it.
now free from the way you would look at it at the time. There are some half decent melodies on it. It's not a good album by any sense, but it's okay.
Yeah, but it really defined. It really sort of. It had a real cultural impact, like Kerrang.
Oh, yeah, sure.
They jumped straight into like Nightwish, Lacuna Coil, Arch Enemy. All these bands made it really big. And I think the blueprint of Evanescence is what sort of made Paramore what they were as well. Also metal albums, Linkin Park, Korn, Godsmack, Limp Bizkit all released albums that year. The Scottish music scene, which Martyn knows is one of my favourites. Areogram released Sleep and Release, which is a brilliant album that you should all listen to.
It's a great album, yeah.
It's really hard to listen to because they try to do so much in it, but it's regularly listed in the top 10 Scottish albums of all time. And without it, we wouldn't have bands like The Twilight Sad and Frightened Rabbit and the people they've influenced. Biffy Clyro released Vertigo of Bliss.
Mm-hmm.
That's such a good album, and they started work on Infinityland that year. They've never topped either of those two albums, but they've become a cultural phenomenon because of that. Mogwai's album Happy Songs for Happy People came out that year, which is not their best album, but it was the first album that they ever had that made the top 200 in the US, and I think that's the time when bands like This Will Destroy You and Caspian really took notice of what Mogwai were doing. Explosions in the Sky released their third album, The Earth Is Not a Cold Dead Place, which is definitely their best
kind
album.
Of most famous one, isn't it? Their most well-known.
Yeah, it got them played on TV.
Yeah.
Now, according to NME and Rock Sound, not me, the album that defined British post-hardcore came out in 2003, and that was Funeral for a Friend, Casually Dressed and Deep in Conversation. And off the back of that made it really, really big. That was all over NME and Rock Sound, and that really launched that whole scene with Reuben, 100 Reasons, Hell is for Heroes, Lost Prophets, all the bands I was going to see as a teenager. I'm going to move away from rock music quickly because I know that... So hip-hop... Kanye West's The College Dropout, although it actually officially dropped in 2004, was leaked in 2003, so I'm claiming it. And obviously that's been claimed as moving hip-hop back away from the violent lyrics and product placement of like 50 Cent and that ilk, and Kendrick Lamar, Childish Gambino, they all cite that as an influence. Jay-Z released the Black Album and then retired.
Did he? Did he stay retired? Because I haven't heard of that guy.
He came back 2 years later, but he retired. I think his announcing his retirement made his back catalogue more popular at the time. Electronic music, M83 released Dead Cities, Red Seas and Lost Ghosts, which, although it wasn't that famous, is really important because M83's electronic music has influenced loads of stuff coming out now. I mean, M83 recently did the soundtrack for Made in Chelsea, if you know what that is. And they were really influential. Fortet, Manitoba, Animal Collective all released great records. The Knife released Heartbeats in 2003. Uncle released Never Neverland.
Yes.
Great album.
Kraftwerk and Massive Attack both released albums that year. Basement Jaxx released Kish Cash. So electronic was pretty good. I'm going to briefly mention classical music because I kind of have to. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, in the last few years of his life, had a massive burst of productivity, released some really interesting stuff. Michael Nyman and Philip Glass both released quite a lot of really interesting stuff as well. Moving on to jazz, Decca Jazz released an album that year, which is interesting because they are a collective of female jazz musicians, and it's designed to give exposure to female jazz musicians. It's a pretty decent record and was aiming to do something great. Amy Winehouse released Frank in 2003.
That's her best record.
And quite important. 2003 proved the dangers of overhyping an album, Metallica's St. Anger.
I think I can hear some steel drums in the background somewhere.
Godspeed You Black Emperor split up, which made me really, really sad. Black Road Motorcycle Club released their second album, Take Them On Your Own.
Yes, one of my all-time favourites.
It's a great album, got loads of critical acclaim, and probably got them dropped from their record label.
Yeah.
On a more positive note, S Club 7 announced they were splitting up.
Didn't they become S Club, like, just S Club first? I think the juniors were a separate project.
Yeah.
There were multiple branches of the S Club.
I think the main S Club, with the people who were in the 7, it was them who split up in 2003.
We've already spent too much time on this.
Nina, it was a really sad year. Like Nina Simone died that year. Johnny Cash died. Morris Gibb and Barry White died. Elliott Smith died and left behind the demos that became From a Basement on the Hill, which is a lovely album. The Dixie Chicks got in trouble for criticising George W. Bush's incursion into Iraq. Google that; it's hilarious.
I think I remember that. I remember.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, there's
They
only
got a lot of stick, didn't they?
they did get a lot of stick, and so there's only one album I've got left to mention.
Was there no records, albums that were punk at the time that were anti-Bush? I can't remember what the titles of them were, but
I mean, I know Powderfinger released a really popular album in 2003. I don't remember that much about it. Hail to the Thief came out in 2003. Yes. That was a great Radiohead album because it built on what they were doing in Kid A and started down that more experimental path, but it also had singles. So like Amnesiac, I really enjoyed, but it didn't sell very well and there weren't really any major singles on it, whereas Hail to the Thief had There, which is the second highest charting Radiohead single ever. Second only to Paranoid Android, and that was on it. So that's a great record as well. So lots of really, really good records that stand up. Like when you listen back to them, the production on them still sounds like you could listen to it today. Whereas like some of those albums from 1991 haven't held up necessarily quite as well. So I think that's the reason I went for 2003 is because there's more to go back to. There was a lot of good music and a lot of really influential stuff as well. And the influential stuff sold and people knew about it.
Yeah. The only thing I say in defense of every other year, and it's not necessarily 2003 that's to blame here, but I think this is mainly a Southwest-centric point of view. I don't really like the hold which new metal had across the Southwest and still does to this day.
Absolutely, I'm with you 100%.
When we had really, really strong other nights that kept off, like, for instance, in Plymouth, we had a night called Neon Kibosh, which really sort of focused in on that kind of hot gossip, new indie electro, which was far more interesting in my view and died out far quicker than it should have.
Yeah.
I think post-hardcore in 2003 is what got rid of that new metal hold to a degree.
The problem with new metal, it wasn't so much the music, because the musicianship was brilliant. It was the juvenile toxic masculinity. As you know, when Woodstock happened and that terrible stuff when Limp Bizkit were playing, that was what ate me up about new metal. I was Deftones, even though they get dumped in with new metal, they shouldn't, because they're a very different band.
It was quite a short-lived cultural impact that it had, though, because I think in defence of 2003, I think 2000, 2001, they're the prime candidates for new metal central years when Linkin Park's got Hybrid Theory out, and there was that Limp Bizkit album, Hot Dog Flavored Water, Chocolate Starfish, or whatever it was called. That's kind of the nadir of that period. By 2003, I think some of the bands that Tom's talked about have kind of cleared the scene out a bit.
The era which I ran to dance music for salvation because I really didn't get involved with that. And
yeah, I did the same.
Hip-hop was just horrible to watch.
Overdone. Rage Against the Machine.
But I think that the new metal, served a certain purpose and filled a certain sort of gap in the musical market, didn't it? And I think, a lot of it was kind of watered down to an extent. It was very angry, but it was pop music, basically. Yeah. But I think that, young people gravitate to something that they think has that kind of rebellion and anger in it, etc. And I think, and a lot of the new metal, it was only on the surface, that rebellion and that anger. But I think that young people just kind of gravitate towards that, didn't you? But then you said you went towards dance music, Dave. I mean, I still stuck it out and listened to hip hop. Basically, that's when I really discovered hip hop. I mean, all of my friends are into new metal, and I think some of them probably still are, quite heavily into it to this day, really.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good records in that movement. I don't think it would be arrogant of us to dismiss it entirely. But I think by the early 2000s, the best records are long gone. The best Korn records are the 90s records, for instance. They'd all done their best work, and then they found a way of introducing it to teenage kids, watering it down, and then they got maybe 2000, 2001, those couple of years out of getting chart hits out of that kind of music. By 2003, people had wisened up a bit, and I think it became a different thing.
Still a juvenile myself, I was trying to find my own scene, and at that time it was 1 or 2 years before dubstep came around, and it was kind of the end of grime. And I was in South London DJing that scene and getting involved with dub sound clashes and stuff. So that was a whole new genre of things to get involved with me. But I just lost interest.
Some of the bands evolved really well, because I mean, Incubus started as a proper new metal band, and they evolved and got better. And I think Deftones did very much the same thing. I think that
Linkin Park as well.
Yeah, I mean, Linkin Park evolved.
I still love "Shut Up and Drive Far Away" is one of my favourite Deftones tracks ever.
It's got to be. I don't know whether to call it Moana or Mona, but that track on the self-titled album is really, really good. I like big, loud, melancholic music, and that Deftones self-titled album is just the epitome of that. It's my driving album to this day because it makes you drive fast. I think
what the Deftones did was they showed that you can make really heavy music with really strong beats and stuff, which the new metal bands were doing musically, but without all of that posturing and like, oh, I'm going to break up everything, just that whole male, like adolescent, just like puberty kind of thing about it. That's why it didn't connect with me. It wasn't aimed at me anyway in the first place. So that's why I was listening to Radiohead and probably music from the 80s back then when that was going on. But it's just the Deftones were one of the perfect bands to show you can still be really, really heavy, really, really kind of like, one of a better word, hip with the young people, because they look like skaters on stage. And without any of that kind of really bad attitude, it's just that kind of just grow the fuck up, take your piercings out and go and get a job. You know what I mean? They kind of, like just stop blaming the world because you're white and you're privileged and you've got rich parents. You're listening to
you sound like a proper grumpy old man now.
I am a grumpy old man these days, man. But I'm allowed to be. I lived through my formative years were in the 90s. I started loving music in 1990. So,
I think it's interesting you say that, because from the perspective of how we've picked our years, I was born in 87, so I don't remember it. 91, I was 4, so I don't really remember 91 at the time. 89, I don't remember. I was 2. I think my earliest memory is from when I was about 2, when I rubbed an entire chocolate biscuit over my face just to amuse my mum. That's like my earliest memory. That's probably about 89, but it's got nothing to do with music. 2003 is a year that I can talk about from memory, so it's the only one. And it's just interesting because a lot of people have said about their formative years and things like that, and it's interesting how music can have an impact on your environment at the time and how it can stick in your memory, and certain events will be linked to certain songs. And so when I was coming in to pick 87, I was coming in completely cold because I don't have anything that I can picture from that year. I'm just focusing purely on songs that I've listened to at a later year. So it's interesting to see how people can associate that. And the reason I brought that up is because Martyn mentioned historical events, and that was a big part of what shaped the culture. Whereas when I looked at 1987, I didn't go for what was going on in the world in 87, because that didn't speak to me as much as maybe the events of 91 would speak to Martyn. So I just thought that was an interesting insight into people's mindsets, really.
Do you know what's interesting about what you just said there, Dan? Is that my decision to choose 91 is, like you said, is based not just on the music, it's based on a lot of other things. I mean, I was basically then starting to learn about social issues. I was learning about things like racism, sexism, sort of social inequality, all of that stuff, through listening to that. Well, usually it was the early Seattle scene music back then. So, Pearl Jam especially taught me a lot about what was going on in the world. You only have to listen to a song like Jeremy. All about male mental health is right there. So the music itself back then, not all of it was probably the best I've heard. But it was so important because it informed what I was going through at that time, a total kind of character change. I was becoming part of the world. So something like Pearl Jam's 10 or Temple of the Dog spoke to me because it was about real issues I was learning about. But this brings me to a point that Tom made. So what I'm basically saying is, Dan, your decision to choose 87 was probably a little bit more objective musically.
That's how I try to do it.
Yeah, which is great, But Tom made a point about saying about the albums back in '91 maybe don't hold up so well as now as they did then. I would disagree with a lot of them. I think a lot of them probably hold up even more than they did back then. And you mentioned record sales, and you can't conflate record sales with influence.
No,
record sales are irrelevant.
No,
It's all about. You think about it, right? What's happened is a record, say in 1991, sells absolutely bucketloads. Michael Bolton. Who's listening to that now? Few housewives. A record like Loveless sells very little. Who's listening to that now? Pretty much any alternative rock guitar music, guitar fan.
I did listen to it the other week on your recommendation.
It's a wonderful album.
It does hold up. It's still important.
It is good.
I think his point was it didn't sell at the time, and it was retrospectively a hit.
Yeah.
But I think as a counter argument even to that, the people that are talking about it now are, our age, and I didn't have the money to go and buy records. And then later on, as I carried on, we were part of the millennial generation that's just downloads things from the internet. So record sales aren't really going to come into our jurisdiction because we weren't really affluent buyers of records.
No.
It's about influence. And something like Loveless is being talked about by music fans now who are just getting into music. So they're being introduced to an album like Love. It's not just Loveless, but there's many albums like it. But because there are bands like, I'm trying to think, someone like The Horrors, for instance. I mean, they've been around a while, but they're massively Loveless. Go back a little bit further, Placebo, Loveless, and vocal about it. Radiohead. You've got electronic acts saying they listen to Loveless. And
to kind of add to that, off on a slight tangent, but this is 2020 at the time of recording. They just released Final Fantasy VII's remake, to talk about video games for a second. And there's a play that's alluded to in that game that's not featured, and it's called Loveless. And it wasn't until this year that I actually read an interview with the guy who was involved in the production of it. I think his name is Tetsuya Nomura. He turns out to be a massive fan of Loveless by My Bloody Valentine, and that's the reason why that play is named as such in that game. So that it even branches out into other media.
It does
as well.
And the Japanese are mad for shoegaze.
Yeah,
they absolutely love it.
Yeah, they've
always been massive audiophiles, haven't they? So
yeah,
and shoegaze is an audiophile genre of music. It's all about texture and sound over songs.
The Japanese way of looking in albums is very interesting. I found out recently that it was actually illegal to dance in nightclubs until 2017. 2017, it was illegal to dance in nightclubs in Japan. This is what I'm hearing. I haven't fact checked it, so I may be completely wrong. But apparently they also discourage people from dancing by putting fruit machines on dance floors to take up room. The Japanese will look at pieces of music as music, but it's the dancing element of it is completely removed. They don't listen to music to dance to. It's a strange thing. I think we could talk a lot about each of the individual years that we've all brought up. I think the point of this discussion is not to get to the bottom of which is the greatest year. That's not going to happen. Everyone's going to have their own opinions because of the fact that music is formed in your mind by how external factors impact your listening experience. We would like to hear what people think. That is why we're making a podcast, because it's so easy to talk about this stuff. We did want to take the time to discuss things that we've been listening to in the current situation. So if you're listening later than 2020, we're currently locked down in our houses. We're not able to socialize. So music becomes a large part of our daily entertainment routine. It certainly has for me. I've been listening to more music now than I have done perhaps for the last 6 months. But prior to the situation we're in, I've been listening to a massive amount of music. 2020 actually was on my shortlist for greatest years of all time. It has been that good this year in terms of discovering not just new music but old music as well, but just releases from 2020. You've got The Weeknd. That's a great album, a lot of 80s pop influence, which is right up my street. That's a great album. In Your Eyes is I'm tipping for record of the year. I really love that. The saxophone at the end is a great touch on that. You've got Childish Gambino had a new record out. It's not as good as this last one, but it's okay. You've got Thundercat had a decent record. Tame Impala's record this year, The Slow Rush, that's a really good album. Fiona Apple, she's come back with a good album first one in a few years, and I've really got into that. It's very strange, very folky, but very good. There's been an enormous amount of releases. Dua Lipa's Future Nostalgia, that's possibly my favourite album so far this year. It's just a great set of well-written pop songs. Her voice is great. The production is phenomenal. It's a brilliant sounding record, and it's very warm. And I'm sure when we're allowed to go out again, you'll hear that a lot in clubs. It's a good piece of pop music. The album I wanted to talk about, though, that I discovered was Emotion. By Carly Rae Jepsen. It's actually from 2015, and I wanted to speak about it. It's not my favourite record that I've listened to in the last few weeks. It's up there. It's a very good piece of pop, but I wanted to broaden people's horizons. I know that a lot of people on this podcast, not just you guys as guests, but people that may listen to this, will be looking for different recommendations, and I don't think you can go too much worse than listening to Emotion by Carly Rae Jepsen. It's just wall to wall bangers. You put it on and there's no tracks that I would skip. You've got some great 80s pop production. The hooks are just incessant. You turn it on and you'll be singing along within 1-2 tracks. It's quite varied in terms of a pop record. There's different tempos, different sounds. There's a very Prince sounding track called All That, which is produced by Devontae Hines, who is Blood Orange, formerly Lightspeed champion. Listen to this record, and it's great. You can't go into it with any prejudice of, it's a pop record, I'm not going to like it. There's nothing of substance to it. The lyrics aren't going to change your life. It's not going to bring a message. There's nothing in it politically. It's not loaded with any deeper meaning. It's just enjoyable, and sometimes we need that in music. Sometimes you just want to put a record on and say, there isn't any agenda with this record. It's just wonderfully written pop. It's not by one particular voice or from one mind. It's an ensemble cast, almost like a TV show, like The Sopranos, of producers making great songs, great hooks. They're all over it, and she delivers it with the right amount of almost selfless projection. There isn't a lot of read into Carly Rae Jepsen on the record. It is just her singing songs written by other people, but it just works. And I think that there need to be more records like that. So if you are ever going to listen to me recommending an album, I would take that one, give it a listen. If you don't like it, probably never listen to anything I recommend again.
I did listen to it, and I didn't mind it, although I will say it just reminded me so much of Churches that I went back and listened to Churches instead. It's great, but a lot of the tracks sound so much like Church's first album, which is a banging album as well. But yeah,
there you go, 2 for the price of 1 in that.
They're both very similar albums. I marginally prefer I definitely prefer the Church's one, but no, I enjoyed it. It was fun to listen to.
Did it broaden your horizons, Tom?
Well, not massively, but it was an enjoyable way to spend a few minutes.
Tom won't be on next week's podcast.
What I gleaned from the album is I found it to be very similar to the Busted album that came out very recently, which just sounds like a bizarre tangent, but it had a very 80s feel, which is the same that I found with this album. You kind of get the same from the Drive soundtrack that was the film with Ryan Gosling.
Yeah.
Very similar sort of thing. It's kind of like leaning a little bit on Italo 80s house, and it's kind of living a bit on the sort of Miami Vice kind of 80s electro stuff.
Don't they call it Vaporwave?
The Vaporwave is a kind of different genre, but yeah.
More multimedia, isn't it, Vaporwave? It's not just the musical, it's all about the video. And
yes, because they have those Simpsons memes. The Simpsons memes with the filters.
Yeah. It's the whole aesthetic.
It reminded me of all of that kind of vibe, that was what I was getting when I was listening to it, sort of that I don't even know if it was encapsulated in a genre per se, but the kind of new 80s sound which people kind of jumped upon in 2014, 15, 16. And it was nice. I love that genre, as you went. Vaporwave, Italo disco 80s Miami Vice kind of driving fucking Lamborghini Countach cocaine driven Marlboro Red bullshit I love. That's my shit. But
The music. We'll clarify.
The music, yes.
I listened to the album, Dan, and it just made me think. It made me feel that I was only going to enjoy that album if I was a 27-year-old mum on the school run listening to Heart FM.
Oh,
That is
Well, I'm glad you think I look 27.
Nah, I jest. It does have that whole kind of Heart FM thing about it, but I listened to it properly, and it's really well produced.
It
The
is.
songs are good. The chord progressions aren't your usual boring first, fourth, fifth thing that everyone does.
There's no 4 chords of doom.
Yeah, the 4 chords of doom, and that was refreshing. And I just thought, yeah, it's nice. He's got a good voice, but if I never hear it again, then that's fine. But yeah, it's well done. It's not aimed at me. It's not meant for me.
It's not aimed at me either. I'm just going to clarify that.
But yeah, I just couldn't connect with it emotionally in any way whatsoever. It just, I'm not saying it's bad. It's just not for me. It's not part of my musical world. But I'm sure that, like yourself, you rate it highly. You hear something different in it.
So recently I've been listening to a rapper called Madia. So her debut album is called Collage. It came out in 1996, which is a great album. It's all very kind of neo-soul influenced, Jay Dilla, Tribe Called Quest, the Uma, that kind of sound. Collage is a great record. I've only discovered her very recently, and her second album was called BB Queen, which was released in 2000, which is a great album as well. Very, very short. It's 7 tracks long, which is the same as Pusha T's Daytona, which came out in 2018, which was actually 7 tracks long as well. So I've been listening to her a lot. I listen to a lot of that kind of sound. Another great group to listen to who are very similar to that is a French production trio, I believe, called Jazz Liberators. On their albums, they've featured some members of the Far Side, people like that. So it's that kind of vibe. And interestingly as well, I think when Pusha T's Daytona came out, and it's only 7 tracks long, I believe 7 tracks is the minimum amount you have to have on an album for it to be considered for the Grammy Awards.
Oh, okay.
I believe it's got to be 7 individual pieces of work to constitute an album to be nominated for it. So there you go.
Interesting. Sounds like something I would want to check out.
Martyn, what would you like us to listen to?
Well, I don't know I'm not going to recommend it as such. It's just something I was listening to for no particular reason, but I was thinking about the album a lot. It's called Gentleman by the Afghan Wigs. Afghan Wigs are a kind of alternative rock Americana band, very influential. They had a massive kind of Motown soul influence to them. Songs mostly about relationships and heartbreak. So obviously this is kind of my world. And but what's interesting about it is you get when you've got songs about relationships and love, they're either love songs, I love you, we're in love, everything's great, or they're heartbreak songs, I've lost you, I'm going to kill myself, whatever, right?
This is why you don't write lyrics, man.
Exactly, yeah. And this is a bit different. And I won't talk about the music because the music is what it is. It's great indie rock. It's beautiful alternative, excellent musicians. But what I'll talk about is the characters that the singer Greg Dully he builds in his lyrics, and it's about usually a man. Imagine him. You're in a Midwest bar, right, in some Midwest town, when there's a truck stop there, and there's just deadbeats and all that stuff. And you're in a bar, and fights are going on, and you're sat at the bar with a whiskey.
I'm picturing Twin Peaks here, Martyn. I'm picturing Twin Peaks.
Yeah, kind of there's One-Eyed Jacks, that kind of thing, right? And there's a blues band playing, right? And you're sat there at the bar with a whiskey, and you've just lost the love of your life because you shagged a stripper, and you're really feeling cut up about it, and you can't help doing it because you're just a fucking mess of a man. That's basically what the lyrics are, and they're great because it's a different take on ending a relationship. It's more about sort of the whole taking ownership about a man who realizes he's got problems, who realizes he probably shouldn't be hitting the bottle, shouldn't be going out all the time, maybe even was probably partly biographical in that he's in a touring band, he's out playing shows every night, likes to drink back in the day, they were rock and roll animals back in the day, that band. And, they probably did a lot of stuff. But it's just a beautifully made album. The lyrics are poetically gorgeous. I'm so jealous of the lyrics. They're just great. And they just deal with, like, the human condition and what it feels like to be just a man who's a shit person to be in a relationship with. So there you go. If you ever feel like that, whack it on.
I quite enjoyed it, actually. It's funny because there's no reason why I got this, but when I was listening to that album today, it reminds me so much of Hope of the States.
Hope of the States. I think musically there's a lot of similarities.
Yeah, but there shouldn't be.
No, but you've got a band from Sussex and a band from where? Maybe I don't know where their African Wigs are from. Even that's Seattle. They're a Washington band, I think.
Yeah, but I was really surprised at how much it reminded me of Hope of the States.
Interesting fact about Hope of the States: I had a best mate once, used to lend me guitars all the time, and he was a guitar tech for Hope of the States. And once I played a gig, took me around to Hope of the States rehearsal studio. Choose any equipment you want to do your gig with. So I used Hope of the States gear.
They were a great band. They were a great band.
They are a good band, although they're not around anymore. One of the guys committed suicide.
Yeah, Jimmy Lawrence. They released another album after he died. So they carried on for a little bit.
That's really sad. I met them, and I lived near the same town they lived in. Used to see them about quite a lot, and they were nice lads.
Yeah, great music, and the violinist's gone on to have a great career as a producer.
Cool,
produced some great records.
Good.
I thought a lot about what album I was going to choose, and figuring that we're in the middle of a pandemic, it made the most sense to pick something quite long because we've got time now, and I'm a big fan of the whole double album. Smashing Pumpkins' Melancholy Infinite Sadness is a cracking album, but the album I went
at the Times 1987 best double album.
Oh no,
The Fragile 9 Inch Nails.
We're not having this debate now. That's coming later. I decided to pick an album called Animal Choir by a band called Her Name Is Calla. I saw them play at a festival in 2016 and really enjoyed it, and then sort of slept on them, and then rediscovered this album after it had come out, and discovered that the band had announced they were splitting up before they released it. And it's just a beautiful album. It blends, it's post-rock is the genre, but they blend a lot of other things in. There's some electronic moments, there's some folk elements in there, there's some heavy bits, like the opening track is called The Swan, and it sounds like swans, which I find quite interesting. The singer's voice is lovely. The lyrics they're pretty melancholy, but I think it's sort of what I needed at the moment. The two tracks towards the end of the album, there's a track called Robert and Gerda and a track called Bloodline, and those two tracks are just stunning. The lyrics are quite, to me, they seem like they're about the end of his band, but they relate to everyday life as well. The musicianship's incredible. It's just an album that I recommend everyone sit down and have a listen through, because it's definitely an experience.
I can vouch for that. It's definitely an experience. You correctly identified that I wouldn't like the first track, but then from then on, it does get very interesting very quickly. The Dead Riff, the second track, is a good track, and the one I like the most on the album that I listened to, I didn't listen to the whole thing because it is quite a long album, but there's a track on it called A Modern Vesper, which is just a left field kind of electronica track out of nowhere, which was really surprising. That was a great listen. I like that. That
track's really interesting because it's a reworking of, I think it's their second single from about 12 years ago, and they reworked it. And it's really good. The Dead Riff is the lead single off the album, and the Dead Riff's quite interesting. When I said to you the other day, it sounds like what would happen if Godspeed Your Black Emperor, fronted by Turin Brakes, covered Fleetwood Mac. And I think that's...
Absolutely. Yes. I hear that now.
I described it as that, And
Turin Brakes, man, that's obscure.
Turin Brakes are not obscure.
No, they are. Compared to all the other 90s acoustic bands, they're the only decent one, I think.
Yeah, the Turin Brakes were amazing. I saw them play 2 years ago at the Hub in Plymouth, and they were amazing. They've still got it. But yeah, it's a great album, and yeah, get yourself in a dark room, headphones all loud, and just listen through it.
That's what I did, and it is. I can attest to that. It is a good album.
Yeah, you won't hear anything else like it.
That's true.
Yeah, you will. Turin Brakes crossed with Fleetwood Mac, crossed with whatever the other one.
Godspeed, you Black Emperor.
Dave, what have you been listening to? What would you like our listeners to join in with?
So the album that I've chosen is Roxy Music, the first album.
The classic.
I chose it because it kind of ties in with the year that I've chosen, in the fact that it's kind of a starting point for a lot of genres and a kind of melting pot for a lot of genres.
Mm.
So the initial track, which is on the album, is sort of teasing. I don't know if there's anyone else catches this, but it's every sort of 3 or 4 bars it has a unique riff or like a guitar riff. Mm. And to me, it kind of sounds like it's got a Beatles riff in there, it's got a Stones riff in there, it's got a soul riff in there, and the track is entitled
Remodel, I think.
Remodel, correct, yeah. And it's kind of like hinting to the whole album that this is going to be a new project, which is a melting pot for everything else that has come before. So they're going to try and remake and remodel everything that they've been influenced by. So that might be Northern Soul, that might be rock and roll, that might be Chuck Berry, that might be, old blues, everything. Everything's going to come into this album.
You could say it's a cacophony.
Exactly. I love the album. We've had a little bit of discussion outside of this chat that there's other albums from Roxy Music people enjoy, which is great. But what I find is this: If There Is Something is the third track on the album, and it's a real sort of meandering, almost starts off country. It's kind of got a slide guitar, and the break is kind of prog rock, and then breaks out the other side into sort of pop music. So it's kind of 3 or 4 genres all at once.
That's my favourite Roxy Music song, I think.
That is a banger. Mm. I really like Ladytron.
Ladytron's great. Mm-hmm. Did Dave? Did you listen to the original LP that doesn't have Virginia Plain, or did you listen to the re-release that has Virginia Plain included?
So I've got the original, which is inherited from my parents' record collection on vinyl.
Because it doesn't have the single on it. It doesn't have Virginia Plain. The version I listened to has that as track number 4 after If There Is Something. And yeah, that track is phenomenal. I don't know how the album would work without that track as well, because it's kind of a centerpiece of the album, and if it's not there, it changes the listening experience. I think when you mentioned remodel, I think the first thing I think of when I listen to that song is it sounds like a proto Virginia Plain that's mixed with there's all those riffs on there, aren't there, from Day Tripper by the Beatles, and you can kind of hear they're going to use the old and make something new, and then they come out the other side with Virginia Plain. I
think it's very similar to what kind of Style Council did. They know what they're going to be doing. They're a progressive modern pop band, but they're going to heavily take influence from the past and credit it. So, which I think is great. And they're a band which I've listened to since I was 7 or 8 years old, and I just think they're a great influence. Obviously, Brian Eno is in the original lineup here. If you've got the double fold LP, his cardigan of leopard print plus blonde mullet is just fucking incredible. Anyway,
I think I need to go through that phase.
If you see how he's dressed in the album sleeve for their second album, For Your Pleasure, that takes it to an even further level.
some of their top of the pops performances are amongst the best ever top of the pops performances. They were just like they were just a mishmash of glam rock with new romanticism and just hippie stuff. It was just very sort of odd, and it worked. They're a very strange band, but they're a very good band.
A quote
Anyone else think that his vocal style was probably a big influence on David Byrne?
Yeah, I can hear that.
And I think he probably took influence from Roy Orbison. He's a very high vibrato singer. But
a quote from my mum: Brian Ferry is the best singer who can't sing that's ever existed. But you haven't mentioned 2HB. So my experience of Roxy music. So my mum had For Your Pleasure on vinyl when I was growing up, and that was the album that got me into it. And then when I was at university, Flaming Lips made a Late Night Tales record, which is where bands make a compilation of the stuff that inspired them. And that's got 2HB by Roxy Music on it, off their first album. And that track is my favourite on that album.
It's a good. That was a single, I believe.
Yeah. It was, yeah. And it's a great track.
Why has no one mentioned the album covers yet?
Well, I was listening actually to another podcast recently, which is Adam Buxton, and he had Noel Rodgers on, and he said when he was dating a woman in London, one of the gigs he went to go and see was Roxy Music, and he was completely blown away by the fact he'd never really seen he'd seen Parliament do their kind of space jazz crazy thing, but they'd never really seen like high fashion being put on stage, and the guys turning up like absolutely dripping in designer gear and models on stage and everything, and he was just completely blown away by that, and then took that on to Sheep.
I always find that Roxy Music seemed like an odd fit for Brian Eno. It's like Bill Bailey being in Metallica or something like that. It's just an odd.
You do a car horn solo.
If you listen to Brian Eno's first couple of solo albums, like Another Green World and Here Come the Warm Jets, if you listen to those after listening to the first two Roxy Music albums, and you listen to what Roxy Music did afterwards, I think you'll actually find it's what did Roxy Music do without Brian Eno rather than
absolutely,
how did Brian Eno. So I think Brian Eno shaped the sound of Roxy Music.
Yeah, definitely. I was talking more stylistically in terms of image. The music is definitely very much Eno, and you can hear throughout what he did in the 70s with Bowie and then with Talking Heads, that kind of sound, that odd brooding kind of synth sound is there throughout all of his work. So musically, he's definitely a right fit. I just think in terms of visuals, it looks a bit jarring.
That's an eclectic set of albums.
It is.
Listen to them all in a row.
No. Listen to them all at the same time.
I think at the just very quickly as well. I think at the moment, like topically, I mean, obviously we've all named albums that we listen to, but I think topically at the moment, if people are looking to tap into and kind of understand a little bit of what's happening in America, then go out and listen to some Public Enemy and some NWA and Outkast, A Tribe Called Quest, some bands like that really have been sort of speaking about this kind of thing for years and years.
I think that's an important thing to kind of get behind at the moment in the times that we're in. So I definitely encourage people to do the same. Go out and listen to not just hip hop stuff from that time, but earlier stuff from the likes of Sam Cooke and the songs that really got the civil rights movement stirring in the 60s. I've been listening to a lot of Nina Simone and a lot of Sam Cooke, especially A Change Is Going to Come. And
Gil Scott-Heron, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's an album I can get behind.
Did anyone hear that story? Apparently, the anonymous hackers got played "Fuck the Police" by NWA over the police radio system.
I hope that's true.
There's videos of it. It's true. It happened.
We would love to hear more things like that in the news. I think at the moment we need to learn to fight the power.
Yeah, boy.
Obviously, we are not inciting violence in any way. I just feel it's important to clarify.
Maybe just slight microcosms of violence within your own room on your own. Maybe if you're slightly angry at one of the records that we've coated down, then maybe just throw something across the room.
Butter a side of toast with intent.
Yeah.
Knock a remote control off your table.
Let's not go too far, Martin.
Right, guys, that's been fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to the inaugural Cacophony Sessions podcast. If you like what you hear, stay tuned because we plan to do a lot more. Let us know what you'd like to hear. You can find me on Twitter at GoldenEPump, and we'll see if we can wring out our conversational cloths together in a future episode. Wow, that sounds sexy. It's a crazy, crazy world out there, kids. So until next time,
Get out of my house.
Yeah, take care, guys. Bye.
Now, love it, bye.
be safe, stay funky.